Which is what if Naruto awakened the Crimson Legacy and built a harem with Kushina and the Queen of Biju. Part 1. And if you enjoy this fanfic, then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now let's start the fanfic. The impact was overwhelming. For a moment that felt like hours, nothing could be seen through the thick, foggy dust. The wind seemed to have stopped blowing, and the grass no longer swayed, almost like time had paused. Everything froze for a moment, or perhaps for an eternity. A light groan echoed from a limp body at the bottom of the crater, instantly disturbing the stillness. It was hardly visible through the clouds of dust that surrounded it. "There's somebody down there," a voice yelled as the air finally started to clear, revealing a still form. A boy laid there motionlessly, only his chest's faint rising and falling indicated that he was still alive. His clothes were torn beyond recognition, but the remains of his once vibrant orange jumpsuit still stood out under the thick layer of dirt. The only thing he could feel was the pain in his stomach. None of his senses seemed to act normally. He tried to breathe, but the simple act of respiration was beyond him. Muffled voices echoed around him, as if he was submerged in water. He groaned again faintly, as debris rained on his form as someone rushed toward his side, slipping down on the edge of the crater. "Hey, wait, that could be dangerous," another voice shouted, sending another dose of small rocks at his already abused body. "Has he got a Hitite? Or anything to identify him?" A gentle touch. Someone with small hands stroked the hair away from his face. A soft moan escaped at the feeling and his eyes slowly fluttered open. But the only thing that registered in front of his eyes was something blue. Maybe the sky. A silhouette appeared above him. When he blinked and tried to focus his eyesight, he only achieved a new stabbing pain in them by the harsh sunlight. He tried to raise his hands to cover his face, but they fell back to the hard ground. "Hey Blondie, stay still. I'll help you," someone whispered gently above him. The still lingering soft dust irritated his lungs and his throat, and his chest squeezed to cough. However, after the sudden stabbing pain, he had to force down the urge. His ribs screamed inside his chest by the sudden strain. A warm sensation entered his stomach and seeped into his internal organs while green light reached his eyes. He tried to speak, tried to push out any word, but the only thing he managed was another groan. The pain in his abdomen increased and he gladly accepted the offered unconsciousness. Muffled noises rapped harshly in his sore ears and brain. He tried to groan in his displeasure, but he couldn't even moan. Consciousness returned to him slowly as he started to hear the conversation next to him. He vaguely registered a sterile felt his mind become clear, but he didn't open his eyes. He strengthened his senses as much as he could and tried to detect any other presences in the room with him. "So, how is our patient today?" The faint sound of flipping pages could be heard. There were only the two men talking around him. They reeked of disinfectant, blood, and illness. Must be some kind of medic. He mused. Bed was uncomfortably hard beneath him, he registered faintly. Surprisingly well after how he had arrived here. I bet he will regain consciousness soon with his extremely high regeneration process. "Wanna join the bet? I'm all finished with my shift," he was the last one. "Wanna go grab some coffee? We can discuss the bet there." "Sure." His eyes snapped open as he heard the door fall shut, but he regretted the motion immediately. The sudden light stabbed him painfully and he squeezed them shut again. Gradually, he tried again, blinking rapidly to clear away the fog of his vision. There was nothing but white around him. White ceilings, white walls, white machines beside him. Yup, hospital. He closed his eyes and tried to think. I was fighting with, wait, hospital. He jerked up on the bed and doubled over, immediately gripping his stomach at a harsh pain in it. His scream echoed through the room and most likely over the whole section. Panting heavily, he mapped his surroundings and looked for an escape route. He checked every corner for an exit but couldn't even find a window. Then he realized he couldn't feel his chakra flow, and recognized a familiar pattern covering his forearms. A chakra binding seal. His brows immediately raised in confusion. Just a second after he screamed, people rushed into the room. Two appeared to be medical staff, judging by their white uniforms. Most likely the ones who were discussing the bet over his recovery. His eyebrow raised until it reached his hairline and his eyes were wide open as four cloaked and masked people appear next to his bed. He glanced up at the masked soldiers and then to the medics in confusion. "Ah, how are you feeling?" asked one of the medics after he shook off his surprise. He received no answer, only a suspicious, sharp glance from the man's electric blue eyes as he finally also gathered his composure. A seventh man entered the room. The blonde immediately locked his gaze on the newcomer in green vest. "Who are you and what are your purposes here?" asked one of the masked men as he stepped closer to his bed. However, he didn't hear the question, freezing at the sight in front of him. His pulse was locked on the symbol on his Hitite. A whirl with a stripe and a triangle. A stylized leaf. Confusion ran across his face, but it was soon replaced with a pained grimace. His expression finally hardened and his eyes narrowed as he forced his brain to work as fast as it could. Come on, remember, I was fighting, I hit that jerk with my last Rasengan and then, oh shit. Idiot, egotistical, red-eyed son of a, he hissed between his clenched teeth and squeezed his eyes shut. The people in the room froze at the statement and shared confused looks. Suddenly he jerked his head up. Why are you doing this to me? He shot toward the white ceiling. Is this really necessary? His voice died down to a soft whisper. He locked his gaze at the empty surface for a long minute, maybe waiting for an answer. But, not surprisingly, none came. He flung his legs off the bed and hopped down, only to wobble from the sudden burden. With a surprised look, he noticed that other than his boxers and bandages, he was. Wow, great plan, you red-eyed moron. Embarrass me to death, he muttered and shook his head with irritation. The medical staff could do nothing more than take a step backward when the boy slowly raised his hands in front of his chest, attempting to perform a familiar jutsu. One of the Anbu jumped closer, gripped his hand and hissed, "Don't bother trying anything. Your chakra is already sealed away. You can't even perform a kawarimi." The only visible reaction was a raised eyebrow as the boy stared at the cat mask, as if he was silently accusing him of being an idiot. "This is the stupidest genjutsu ever," he muttered to himself, shaking his head disapprovingly once more. "Genjutsu?" asked back the confused cat. The boy didn't answer, instead finished what he started, "Kai." The effect was instantaneous as a shockwave of chakra flew from the center. Only the 4 Anbu were able to stay on their feet, everyone else stared at the boy wide-eyed from the ground. "What the hell?" he mumbled. "What the hell is going on?" "Kai." Another chakra wave lashed out from him, bigger than anything they'd ever felt. It sent them all crashing into the walls, knocking most of them unconscious with its force. At this point, in the center of the village, an old man let his mouth drop. His ever-present pipe fell to the desk with a clatter, spreading ash and embers across the papers and scrolls waiting to be inspected and signed. In the hospital, the boy burst through the room's only exit to come face to face with another small group of people in the hall. He froze immediately, wide-eyed, as he looked at the older man standing before him. Surprisingly, the older man also paused and stared in disbelief despite his years of experience on the battlefield. It was like looking into a mirror, their age and some minor physical characteristics the only difference between them. The boy suddenly averted his eyes, as if he didn't dare to face the man in the hall anymore, like a small child would do, who couldn't look up to his parents' eyes after doing something bad. He glanced back at the newcomer only from the corners of his eyes. The boy finally braced himself to look back at the man. His pools were filled with sadness, love and shame. Before he closed his eyes and muttered to himself, "You're not here. You aren't real. Everything is just part of his sick mind game. Minato, brace yourself." One of the man's comrades barked in an attempt to break said man's frozen state. "I know," he hissed back. The boy snapped his head toward the voice as he also came out of his temporary stasis. While his attention was focused on the shouting man behind Minato, a strange kunai with 3 prongs flew towards him. He didn't even bother to deflect it, he just leaned his head to the left to let it pass by him. At the moment the weapon passed his ear, Minato's form appeared behind him, with the same blade pointed to his neck, ready to slice his throat open. Nothing had been visible, only the yellow flash of his golden hair. "You know I'm as real as the weapon which threatens to slice your neck." "I don't think so," the younger blonde replied as if they were casually discussing their day over a bottle of sake. "But I always wanted to see this with my own eyes. Or, whatever. Great, now I'm talking to myself." "What are you talking about?" Minato blurted out. "Shinobi fighting lesson number 2. Genjutsu," he stated casually with the air of a sensei. "Kurama, would you please be so kind as to do something about this ridiculous situation?" "Naruto, I think this isn't a genjutsu." Naruto's eyes widened and in the next blink he entered his well-known mindscape, the canal where the 9-tailed fox enjoyed his hospitality. However, during the last half-year, it had changed. It still resembled an underground canal, but in the middle of the ankle-deep water, there was a large patch of green grass with soft light and slowly swinging osier trees despite the lack of wind in the place. A bright orange canine rose behind the trees and watched the boy with his glowing red eyes. "What?" Naruto asked, a strain in his voice. It revealed its razor-sharp teeth and answered with a puzzled expression. "I said, I think this isn't a genjutsu." "What do you mean this isn't a genjutsu?" "This must be because of that bastard's Sharingan. The last thing I remembered when that red-eyed." Naruto's breathing and heart rate increased, while something squeezed his chest inside his mindscape. Thoughts raced inside his mind with insane speed, the irritation was slowly replaced by panic and confusion. The giant fox narrowed his flaming eyes and barked out to snap his jailer out from his state. "Calm down you idiot or you'll get us killed. I'm trying to figure out what's going on and think of a plan." And with a flicker of an enormous tail, Naruto was kicked out forcefully from his own mindscape. Minato was still holding his kunai to his neck. Naruto's breathing soon became grasping as thoughts raced across his mind. Then he suddenly closed his eyes, with a deep frown on his face, obviously started to think. Just calm down, Minato hissed into his ear. A heavy snap echoed in the passage and Minato's stomach twisted as he blinked down with one eye just to see what he had already known. The boy had broken his own finger on his left hand. His index finger was now accusingly pointing at him at an awkward angle. When nothing changed, Naruto slowly turned his head to look over his shoulder. The kunai drew a thin red line on his neck. Not so deep as to threaten his life, but deep enough for any other shinobi to hiss in pain. But Naruto didn't show any sign of pain. His wide and confused eyes were glued on Minato. The mixture of emotions fell from his face. Denial, confusion, relief, then devastating joy. Now do you see that I'm speaking the truth about this being reality and not a genjutsu? Minato muttered once again to the boy, who winced as an only reaction when his voice reached his ears. His eyes were still stared at him unblinkingly. This is impossible, he finally pressed out in a powerless voice, muttering more to himself than to the surrounding people or to Minato. I told myself the same thing when I felt that burst of chakra back at my office. The voice came from beyond the shinobi in front of him, who were now parting as someone approached. The boy froze and his muscles tensed. Naruto tried desperately to will his body to remain upright. His lungs began to burn, screaming for air despite his quickening breath, and a cold feeling seeped into him. Suddenly, his body refused to hold his weight and he crumpled limply to the cold floor. Minato had just barely been able to move the three-pronged weapon away before it could seriously wound the trembling boy. Naruto dimly heard that the fox was speaking to him continuously, but he couldn't comprehend Kurama's fading words anymore. He looked up just in time to see a familiar old man step in front of him in a white robe, a pipe protruding from his mouth, before his vision started to become foggy. He could still smell the familiar scent of the burning tobacco wafting from his pipe. Gigi, he softly whispered toward the aging man's blurry silhouette. The raw panic that had been clutching his mind and soul began to shift, morphing into a semblance of hope as his vision closed in on itself. His lungs were desperately pulling in air but it still felt like he couldn't breathe. No longer able to withstand the stress of his situation and over-rampant emotions, his mind surrendered the fight to stay conscious. He passed out with a gentle smile on his face with one last glance toward the blurry image of the old man, his eyes full of hope, before his eyelids buried his irises. Sarutobi looked up from the unmoving body to meet Minato's blue pools, with the same unmistakable shade which only seconds ago looked up at him from the floor, hope, relief, respect, and love abundant within them. Sarutobi sighed and turned fully toward Minato. I would be very pleased if you could explain what the hell happened here within the last 5 minutes. Minato blinked and stayed silent, his eyes still glued on the motionless form at his feet. Minato, the named man shook his head with a confused expression on his face. I don't know, I really don't. Minato had decided to stay with the boy when he had lost consciousness. He slowly stood up from his chair next to the door and walked to the bed where the young boy laid beneath the white sheets. He couldn't be more than 18. Possibly less. Originally he had been asked to check on the boy because a sealing scroll and many tags with seals transcribed on them had been found among his belongings when they brought him to the village. They couldn't figure out if they were dangerous, or even what they were for. When Minato had first seen him, he'd frozen. He hadn't reacted like that in years, not since he'd been promoted to Chunin. He'd frozen from surprise. If he hadn't seen his parents die during the war he could have sworn they were relatives. The boy's hair was slightly shorter. His facial features were a little rougher, there were strange whisker marks on his cheeks, but he resembled Minato too closely. His eyes were the same color, same as his own and his father's. Exact copies, right down to the little white flecks in the center. What really upset him was the boy's strength. A Hyuga medic had already checked his chakra system before he first woke up, and he said that the boy had extremely well-developed chakra coils, something that someone at his age would never have. Only the veteran of veterans should have had a chakra system developed to that level. The Hyuga could only compare it to Sarutobi. To the Hokage himself. Minato sighed and strolled back to his chair. They made a lot of security enhancements because of the boy. When he woke up for the first time he knocked out 4 Anbu, 1 Junin and 2 medical ninja with his chakra pulse to release a non-existent genjutsu. Now, 2 whole Anbu squads were surveying him, and Minato also put a new chakra binding seal on him, which would continuously consume most of his chakra and leave the boy on the level of a normal civilian. As extra precaution, he also put paralyzing seals on the boy, so when he woke up the only thing he'd be able to do is blink. A special treatment to restrain even a rampaging cage. His thought was interrupted by a new sound from the bed as a groan escaped from the boy's mouth. He blinked in surprise as he tried to raise his hands to reach his throbbing forehead. But he couldn't move his arms, as a pair of bindings tightly constricted his wrists and ankles. Nor could he move any other parts of his body, not even his pinky. They were heavy as lead. The only thing he could do was blink and groan. "If you stay still this time, I'll remove some of the paralysis seals, so you can move a little and speak properly," a strict voice said from one of the corners. His eyes snapped toward the voice, but he still couldn't see who was speaking. "Blink once if you understand, then twice if you accept the deal." The boy hastily blinked 3 times and a blond man appeared in his line of sight and towered above him. The man eyed him suspiciously with a frown on his face, but after a short moment he put his hands down on several parts of his captive's body and channeled chakra into them. Finally, he started to feel something. But every part of his body that was released was now tingling with numbness, like there were thousands of ants marching inside his veins. He grimaced and hissed at the uncomfortable feeling. The other blonde above him gave a small smile, but his eyes were observing every twitch of his muscles suspiciously. "The numbness will wear off in a minute." The blonde only nodded and shut his eyes tightly, waiting for the remaining tingling sensation to wear off from his body. "Can you talk?" "Why yes," the young blonde's voice cracked back to him. "Why am I fettered? I'm asking the questions. Once I'm finished, you can ask whatever you'd like." "Understood." The young blonde immediately nodded and shut his halfway open mouth. "What are your purposes here?" I don't know. Where am I anyway?" Minato didn't answer, only asked another question in the same commanding tone. "Why did you think this was a genjutsu?" "Genjutsu?" The boy muttered confusedly. "What genjutsu?" A deep frown crawled up on Minato's face as he chose his next words carefully. "Do you know me? This is the first time I've seen you." Minato blinked in surprise and his eyebrows creased as he frowned. "What's your name, rank, and village?" The boy stopped and stayed in silence for several seconds. His gaze dimmed as he concentrated for long, silent seconds. "Answer the question." Minato barked out in a commanding voice, making the young blonde flinch. His eyes suddenly focused again. The voice lacked any kindness, only contained the impatient demand. He stared to his left just like someone who does his hardest to remember something. Or to make up something. His eyes suddenly widened. "I don't know. I don't remember a thing." "What do you mean you don't remember anything?" Minato's voice echoed in the small hospital room. This wasn't new to him. A lot of captured shinobi resorted to this trick, especially in the last few years of the war. Amnesia. Couldn't they have come up with something more creative? He muttered to himself. It was disappointing, really. "What's the last thing you remember?" Minato barked after a sigh. The young blonde blinked, and his frown deepened in concentration. It's you, standing above me. But before that, it's blank." The boy's voice became ragged, and the air left his lungs with a whistling sound at his next exhale. His breathing increased, and his azure pools didn't stop traveling back and forth between him and the room. Just like a cornered animal, Minato could even hear his wildly drumming heart behind his ribs. Great, another spy acting the fool, at least he knows his stuff. The yellow flash let out another sigh and started to massage his forehead in frustration. He really thought the boy would at least come up with something more interesting to explain his previous behavior. The boy finally regained some of his composure as he finally let his wild blue eyes linger on Minato. His voice was shaky, and his throat must have been sore as he cracked, "Where am I?" The blonde shinobi looked back to the boy, but he refused to give him an answer. "Who are you and why am I bound to this bed?" Minato was lost in thought as he eyed the blonde beneath him. "Who am I?" He still received no answer. "Am I a criminal?" "That remains to be seen," Minato finally said with a calculating glance. He ran his fingers through his blonde locks, and the frown was once more on his fine features. "I'll go and inform the medics and Hokage-sama about your current state and that you are conscious. Stay still, and don't try anything. The medics will examine your head while we try to gather some information about you." The boy nodded in understanding and forced himself to calm down and gain more control over his breathing and his storming emotions. As Minato left the room, he turned back to the boy from the doorway and gave him another suspicious glance over his shoulder. What he received in return confused him yet again. The boy forced his head up as much as he could from the bed and gave him a small, hopeful smile. "Thank you." Minato shook his head and closed the door to inform the medics, as well as to give his report to the Hokage. 10 minutes later, Minato was staring up at the Hokage Tower in the middle of the village. With a sigh, he approached the entrance with slow steps and nodded with a friendly smile to the chunin next to the elaborate wooden door near the front of the building. His eyes ran over the carvings. His pools were locked on the various details that experienced hands had carved into the hardwood during the first Hokage's reign. It was a ritual he did every time he stepped through them. His eyes stayed more on the center of it, where a small flame shouted away the identity of the village. Otherworldly plants framed the will of fire, their stems circling all the way around the great carving. Uncountable amount of leaves, buds and flowers made the design flawless. Shinobi passed him as most of the Genin and Chunin teams had received their mission scrolls and were now beginning their next tasks, or perhaps marching into their doom. Minato ascended the stairs and was now standing in front of another wooden door which led to the Hokage's private office. Letting out a last exhale, he knocked on the door and entered when permitted. Hokage-sama. He gave a bow towards the man behind the desk and received a welcoming nod in return. Minato strolled to the center of the room and sat down in a chair in front of the large desk, which was already buried under a mass of papers and scrolls despite the early hour. He surveyed the battlefield on the desk, and a faint smile tugged his lips upward. Beginning of a long day, Hokage-sama. The older man tracked his eyes toward the mess and gave a weary shrug. As it seems. What do you want to report to me? Minato's posture immediately straightened. The boy that we found in our training ground last week is awake again, and he claims to suffer amnesia. The older man let out a sigh, closed his eyes while beckoning for Minato to continue. He claimed that he doesn't remember anything before waking up. He doesn't even recognize me and stated that he had never seen me before, despite his first reaction when he saw me in the hallway, Minato replied. The Hokage closed his eyes, and a deep frown appeared on his face, deepening the starting wrinkles on his face. What are your opinions on this, Minato? It's hard to tell. He shook his head in frustration. If he's a spy, then he's either really terrible or a genius. What kind of spy would reveal his strength before assessing the situation? And going by the security seals, no one suspicious crossed the gates, so he shouldn't even be here. The seals didn't detect any illegal entry at the border. If he lied about the whole thing and this is a part of some well-planned attack, then he must have experience well beyond his years. I honestly can't tell if he's lying or not, and he seems to truly believe he has amnesia. He was confused and disoriented. However, when I left, he thanked me for my help. Minato shook his head and waited for the Hokage's answer. Hiruzen finally opened his eyes to look up at the blonde. Have you any reasonable ideas about what's going on at this point, Minato? I suggest that before we make any conclusions we should interrogate him properly, and I also suggest we involve a professional from Konoha's torture and interrogation force. If he truly is a spy, then we will need a full mind scan from a Yamanaka. The Hokage stared back at Minato in contemplation, then started to chew on the end of his pipe. Let it be so. I entrust you with this case. Please make the necessary arrangements. Minato nodded, rose from his chair, and stopped for a moment, staring back to the Hokage. Hokage-sama, yes, are you sure you've never met him before? Sarutobi looked up from his desk at Minato and blew out the tobacco smoke from his lungs. I'm certain. He has a very unique appearance. I'm not so old as to become senile just yet. Minato bit down on his lower lip and after a second of hesitation he accepted the answer, nodding before he bowed, and left the Hokage alone within his never-ending battle with the bureaucracy. Sarutobi Hiruzen locked his gaze on the closed door with a deep frown for a few minutes. The sudden appearance of the boy worried him, and he was also worried about Minato. After returning from his last mission at Kusa, the promising young man had fallen into depression. A knock halted his troubled thoughts before he could further evaluate the blondes. Come in. A woman pushed the door open with her elbow, and Sarutobi's face fell. Hokage-sama, we received the last of the missing mission reports from the West Wing, and there's also the official invitation for today's council meeting. Here are the necessary documents for it. Hiruzen let out a sigh and started to eye the new tower of paper in front of him. Then let the battle begin, he murmured to himself as the woman left the room with an apologetic look. Minato entered the base of the torture and interrogation force somewhere in Konoha to arrange everything. He knocked on the door and entered as he received permission from the inside of the office. A middle-aged man dressed completely in black looked up from the table and greeted the young shinobi. Ah, Minato-san, it's good to see you again. It's been ages since we last met. Minato sent an apologetic smile at the man. It's good to see you too. I was on the battlefield for the last month. Yes, I heard. What brings you here? I have a job for you. We found a boy last week at one of our training fields, but I'm sure you already know about this. The black-clad man nodded and didn't interfere, so Minato continued. He is awake, and I would like to request a proper interrogation and full mind screen. He claims to have amnesia. A grimace spread across the man's face. Something between disgust and despise. So another spy. We don't know yet, Minato stated warily. But yes, based on our experience in the last few years, he seems to be. I would like to start it as soon as possible before he has the chance to gather any more information than he already has. His condition is stable, almost completely healed despite some minor scratches, so it can be done in the department. I'll inform my team then. Thank you. I'll bring him in myself in 20 minutes. Minato bowed courteously before leaving the room to make the necessary arrangements for the transfer. 15 minutes later Minato was again next to the young boy's bed. "Hello again," he greeted the boy, who gave a nervous look to him with a small, forced smile. "Ah, hi, you will be moved to another place for questioning. After we finish there, I will attempt to answer any questions you may have." The boy was nervous, but didn't show any sign of suspicious behavior. He slowly nodded and warily looked at the two masked people behind Minato. "So what now? I'll remove the shackles, but I won't undo your seals. You won't be able to move on your own." The boy nodded again, his calm facade slowly fading as he nervously eyed the two masked shinobi while Minato removed the leather shackles. The two guards, a little rougher than it was necessary, lifted him by his armpits, and he prayed to every kami that the Anbu wouldn't release him because if they did, he would fall face down on the hard tiled floor. Minato nodded to the two Anbu, and they disappeared with the boy in a swirl of leaves. When he arrived at the torture and interrogation force, the young boy found himself sitting in a chair in the middle of a small room with pale white walls, dressed in slacks and t-shirt by his previous two Anbu guards, which was, by the way, easily his most embarrassing experience. Well, at least he hoped so because it was already bad enough. He tried to shift his limbs to a more comfortable pose but failed to twitch them more than mere millimeters. He silently cursed and accused his misery to the paralysis seals all over his body, completely forgetting about the thin wires around his ankles and wrists securing him again, this time to his chair. The only furniture visible was a desk and another chair opposite him. A large mirror made up most of one wall. The boy stared at the desk. He couldn't shake off the nudging feeling at the back of his mind that he was being watched. The blonde closed his eyes and furrowed his brow in concentration. The two masked men stood outside the door. His eyes slowly opened and traveled toward the mirror and tilted his head to the right. There were two more men watching him from behind the mirror. One of them was definitely the blonde who spoke with him at the hospital, but he couldn't recognize the other. Minato stared back into the boy's blue eyes in disbelief. He stepped a little bit to the right, and as he suspected, the eyes followed his movement instantly. He glanced at his comrade, who stroked his bare chin, lost in his thoughts. Minato furrowed his brows and opened his lips. "Well, this is impressive. We can confirm that he has outstanding sensing ability without any doubt." The boy's eyes wandered from Minato to fix onto his comrades, who nodded in agreement. "Very impressive indeed. This room was built to conceal our chakra, scent, and sound. We should be totally isolated, but he can still sense our presence." Minato nodded again and turned to his comrade. "Makoto-san, let's begin." The two men left the room and entered their prisoner's hold. Makoto sat down in the empty chair, while Minato leaned against the wall behind him, arms folded in front of his chest and nodding to the boy, who gave him a small, forced, and definitely nervous, smile in exchange. The lead interrogator cleared his throat to gain the captive's attention, and the boy immediately swept his head toward the new voice. "If you stay calm and answer honestly, there's no need to be nervous. I'm Kawa Makoto, and the man behind me is Namikaze Minato, if you don't know it already." The boy nodded and gave one more forced smile, this time to Makoto. "We haven't had the opportunity to properly introduce ourselves at the hospital," he mumbled weakly, a small embarrassed grimace equilibrating on his lips. "Well, then, it's your turn to introduce yourself to us. Who are you and where are you from?" The boy started nervously chewing his lower lip and looked down at the table, stubbornly staring the curves of the wood, then shook his head after a long pause. "As I said to Namikaze-san, I don't remember a thing. My first memory was waking up in the hospital and him talking to me." He shook his head again and looked back to Makoto. "I really want to remember, and I really want to help you. Believe me, this is as frustrating to me as it is to you. I don't have any intentions of harming anyone. I don't even know where I am, what happened to me, or how the hell I got here." The last part of his sentence bubbled out with frustration. He was nervous. He still didn't know a thing. Nobody told him where he was or why was he in a hospital and why they handled him as if he was a criminal. His neck and stomach still stung a little, but other than that, he felt okay physically. The blonde named Minato promised that he would get answers after they finished, and he really wanted those answers. He was frustrated, confused, tired and hungry as all hell. Makoto continued to ask the blonde random questions about random things. About shinobi life in general and of course about his past. Where he was from, what his intentions are in the village were repeated several times. And he asked how he received the wound on his neck and stomach. At least he knew why they had been stinging. He told him random names, but none of them sounded familiar. The blonde couldn't answer any of them. Makoto tried every method in his repertoire to get any kind of suspicious answer, but the boy seemed to be honest. He tried to be kind. He tried to be stern, then threatening. He tried to confuse the boy. But there was no sign of a lie, no spike in his chakra flow, no sweating, no shaking, not even a tense muscle. After long hours of questioning, the boy's eyes snapped to the door behind Makoto. In that moment, a short knock broke the silence of the room, and a tall man with long, dark blonde hair tied in a waist-long ponytail that swung at his back entered. The two men in the room shared a surprised look. The boy knew that someone was coming, and they sensed nothing. They were veteran shinobi, and Minato himself couldn't tell that Inoichi was approaching despite also having remarkable detection. Shook his head and sighed for what felt like the 100th time that day. Minato-san, Makoto-san. The newcomer gave a short bow to them. We just finished. Any questions in advance about what we're looking for? Asked Minato as he shook away the surprised look from his face. No, I have a pretty clear idea. Minato nodded and turned to the boy. This man is Yamanaka Inoichi. He's here to help you regain your memory and help us clear up who are you. Inoichi let a grimace slip through his composure. He was actually here to help them decide whether or not that boy intended to do any harm to the village, to decide the boy's fate of whether or not he lived or died, his judge and jury to put it bluntly. The boy gave him a small smile and a nod. His eyes were full of the hope that Inoichi was doubtful he could give him. He tossed his feelings to the side and stepped beside the boy and put one of his hands on his forehead. Now, relax. This will only be painful if you resist. The boy nodded nervously and closed his eyes. Inoichi mimicked him, his forehead wrinkling in concentration as he attempted to reach the boy's consciousness. The blonde relaxed himself and resisted his natural urge to do anything to hinder him while the interrogator entered his mind. It was easier than usual. Inoichi felt the boy's determination to lend him access to his memories. Most of the people placed under his hand tended to resist and fight hard to counter his jutsu. Well, not that those minor attempts hindered him. There was no way they could resist a veteran interrogator. Being allowed to enter someone's mind, however, felt unfamiliar. With a faint click in his mind, his jutsu succeeded. A projection of the interrogator appeared inside a long passage lined with shelves, slumping under the enormous quantity of scrolls and books. This was the boy's general knowledge, gathered since the time of his birth. Inoichi stepped to one of the shelves full of scrolls and picked a few at random, reading the titles. Calligraphy, Basic Fire Ninjutsu, Advanced Tiger-Style Taijutsu, Mixing Colors. Inoichi raised an eyebrow and moved to the next title. Itching Powder. What? He frowned and moved to the next shelf to examine some more. War Tactics, Advanced Stealth, Location of Female Bath Houses. The mind reader found himself very confused. The boy's general knowledge was a huge, chaotic mess of subjects. Most people's minds separate various banks of knowledge and categorize it by subject. He moved to the third shelf, where he found Upper-Level Elemental Chakra Manipulation, Advanced Wind Element Ninjutsu, Upper-Level Kinjutsu, Animal Taming and Care. He shook his head to clear his thoughts and moved toward the end of the passage, where he arrived at the symbolic door of the boy's consciousness unopposed. He opened it, bracing himself for what may come. Inoichi had to shut his eyes and shield them with his hands as the scene reached his non-existing body. It was bright, too bright, and his vision still burned from the overwhelming light that had engulfed his irises after the dim passage. He blinked rapidly to clear his vision, but he still had to rest a minute to compose himself. Finally, he braced himself and stepped over the doorstep and inside the room, turning around only to see nothing, nothingness all around. He turned to the door and looked around behind it, but the only thing he could see was more of the void. White, white everywhere, white sky, and pure white sand as it slowly circled on the ground by a light breeze, which drew small dunes and abstract lines and curves into the soft sand. Not in an aggressive way, but as one would in a Zen garden. It was so peaceful, he felt that he could stay there forever, escape his problems, get away from the real world. He took a deep breath and sniffed at the air. The sweet smell of lilies lingered around him. The symbol of hope, faith, birth, purity, renewal and finally, the promise. This brought a small smile to his face. Strange. Usually when he was in someone else's mind, he felt very uncomfortable. He always felt like he was an intruder as he was one actually, but this place was different. He looked around one more time to leave but his eye caught something jutting out from under the white sand. He tilted his head to the side as he studied it. It looked like paper, or a document, only one of its corners visible. He turned towards it, and slowly started walking in the sand. Secretly enjoying the sensation as the grains shifted under his feet. Inoichi stopped at the paper and leaned down to pick it up. It was a photo, an old, wrinkled and cracked photo of two smiling girls in front of a counter probably in a restaurant. Experienced eyes searched for any symbols where the photo was taken, but he found no familiar places in his memory. Nor he could spot any clan symbols as both girls were in casual clothes. One with short pink hair gently smiled at the one behind the camera, while the blonde next to her held two fingers over the pinket's head while they took the shot. Bunny ears. The oldest prank since photography existed. Her eyes sparkled cheekily and her long, blonde hair streamed down on her shoulders in a high ponytail. Inoichi's lips turned up into a kind smile and he brushed his fingertips along the surface of the photo where the blonde girl was. Suddenly, he heard muffled voices behind him and immediately spun around on his heels. The young blonde girl from the picture lay in front of him, her eyes closed, but nothing out of the ordinary. No wounds, no blood, like she was just sleeping. However, her chest didn't rise and fall like it should do. It stayed motionless. The pink-haired girl knelt next to her, appearing to be fighting for her friend's life. Her hands glowed green, sweat pouring from her forehead, her eyes wildly scanning her still body. The pink-haired girl gritted her teeth, while salty tears balanced on her eyelashes, ready to drop on her pale cheeks and leave a thin wet line on her unnaturally white skin. "Sakura," a soft, tender voice said from behind Inoichi, but before he could turn towards its source, a person stepped through him like a shadow, a ghost without a body. The blood froze in his non-existent veins as the person stepped out from his non-existent body. The hair on his neck started to rise and goosebumps covered him from head to toe. He could see the blonde boy again, clad in a long worn-out overcoat with a black flame pattern at the bottom. Inoichi stepped aside to see the scene from a better perspective. A deep frown appeared on his face as he ran his eyes over them. His eyes were searching for any signs, any hints where they were from, but there were no clan marks. The only thing he could spot was a strange forehead protector he had never seen before, and it only puzzled him more. It contained only one word on the blonde's forehead, instead of the well-known symbols of the hidden villages, shinobi. The boy stopped behind the pink-haired girl and knelt down to cover her hands with his own. "Sakura, please, let her go." The young Kunoichi didn't answer, only vehemently shook her head. Her tears let go of her eyelashes and rained all over the place, not leaving out the reassuring hands on her own. "Please, you know that you can't help her anymore," he pleaded once more. The pink-haired girl squeezed her hand as the green aura slowly faded. They didn't speak, the boy just hugged her tightly for several minutes before he dared to open his mouth again. "Sakura-chan, just please, believe in me, and I'll handle everything." They stayed in silence for another minute before the boy spoke again. "Tomorrow, it will be over. I promise." Only fiery determination was shown in the azure eyes of the young boy. "And I don't go back on my word. That is my nindo. You can trust me, you know that, don't you?" The girl nodded, and the boy continued. "I told you that I'll break the cycle of hatred. I'll break this curse. If there is such a thing as peace, I'll find it. Believe in me. This is my legacy that they left for me." The kunoichi didn't reply. Instead, a small sob escaped from her mouth as she leaned nearer to the boy's chest for comfort. "You were always like this, you idiot. You don't have to do everything alone. You don't owe the world anything. Don't bear such a burden alone." The mixture of the boy's emotions hit Inoichi's mind. Hatred, rage, sadness, strong determination to save everyone, to change the world. The apparition gradually faded away, and he was alone again in the white desert. He looked down to his hand and watched as the picture disintegrated, the breeze carrying the fragments away to assimilate with the white sand. The remains of his memories. That were the sand everywhere. Inoichi was always a professional, a veteran shinobi, and during his tasks he always hardened his mind and heart, never letting the captive's emotions overwhelm him. But when he witnessed the death of the blonde girl, his heart broke apart for reasons unknown to him. He shook his head to clear his thoughts and emotions, then turned around to take one last look at the landscape before stepping out from the boy's mindscape. Inoichi looked down at the heavily panting boy, watching as his head sagged limply in exhaustion, then he nodded to his comrades. "We'll let you rest a little, then we can speak again," Minato said while the boy next to Inoichi nodded without looking up, still trying to catch his breath. Inoichi made one last glance at the panting boy. His hair shrouded his eyes as his head hung to his chest. A small wet line traveled down on his cheeks. Maybe it came from his sweaty forehead, but it was most likely from his tears that were escaping his squeezed eyelids. That memory, it shattered something in him for sure. He finally tore his gaze away to look into his companion's eyes that demanded answers, but he instead shook his head and motioned toward the door. He wanted to offer some privacy for the boy to gather his emotions. The three men marched out from the interrogation room to occupy the room on the reverse side of the mirror. "So, what did you find out inside?" asked Minato, turning to Inoichi. "He remembers nothing." Inoichi paused before continuing. "He has a very great, but chaotic cache of general knowledge, but beside this, his full mindscape was an empty desert. I only found one memory fragment." Inoichi frowned as he remembered the blonde girl and the boy's determination to change the world. He shook his head and continued. "I don't think he is a threat. What was that memory about?" Inoichi turned to Makoto and frowned again. "It's easier to show you. May I?" The two shinobi nodded, and Inoichi placed his hands to their forehead. "I hate this part, this feeling. Makoto muttered and rolled his shoulders while Minato's eyes widened as the memories flooded into his mind. It's not my cup of tea either, but it's faster than it is to transfer it to the projector room and then come back, Inoichi muttered back in the same distasteful voice. I think we can make our conclusion now. He isn't a spy. Most likely he was part of a small gang fighting against someone. Full surveillance is necessary while he is in the village, Minato stated to the shinobi around him, who nodded in agreement. I'm going back. I promised I'd give him some answers when we were finished. Please give your report to the Hokage as soon as it is possible. I'll make mine when I finish up here. Makoto, you'll have to arrange a surveillance room for him here while we come up with a better solution. This way you can check on him from time to see if he regains any more of his memory. Makoto nodded to them as a farewell and left the room. Inoichi's eyes wandered back to the boy behind the glass, meeting with the boy's blue ocean staring into his own. He collected his composure, but the glittering wetness under his eyes told tales about his feelings to the interrogator. Then Inoichi finally realized something. He gave a questioning look to Minato, who shook his head. Don't ask. I don't know how he's doing it. Minato chuckled and shook his head again. Interesting kid, isn't he? Indeed. The interrogator agreed with a hushed tone, his eyes glued on the boy as Minato entered the interrogation room once more. It seems that you're clear. Minato smiled at him and earned his first sincere smile from the boy. Can I ask now? Yes, feel free, but first I'll untie you and remove some of these seals. The boy nodded and let Minato remove the wires and deactivate the remaining paralysis seals. Who I am? The boy asked while he massaged his now aching wrists. The familiar and not to mention frustrating tingling sensation had returned when the seals were removed. This is a question whereupon I also haven't got an answer. We don't know yet. The boy nodded in understanding but wore a disappointed look on his face. His shoulders slumped, and he couldn't stop staring at the table in front of him for long minutes. He finally raised his head. Where am I? Minato occupied his last position at the wall, leaning against it with his hands casually resting in the pockets of his blue slacks. It felt too familiar for the blonde, and he couldn't shake off the deja vu feeling at the somehow lazy pose. You were in the heart of fire country in Konohagakure no Sato. You appeared a week ago in one of our training grounds. You made quite a big impact, literally as well as figuratively. My genin team found you in the middle of a crater. You were badly wounded and could have died on the field if one of my team members hadn't given you immediate medical care. The boy didn't speak. He tried to process the new information and force his brain to remember. What about my memory loss? Minato shook his head. No, your head is completely fine. However, you were clearly fighting with someone. They found no sign of head trauma or any jutsu that would cause your amnesia. Why was I handled like a criminal? This is because of two things. 1. We are in the middle of a war. We've captured several spies in the past that have claimed to have amnesia. The boy made a small nod. 2. When you woke up yesterday, the boy gave a confused look to him. Quote. You knocked out 5 highly trained shinobi and 2 medics while attempting to dispel a non-existent genjutsu. The boy stared down at his hands in shame, not daring to look back at Minato. I'm sorry, I really didn't mean to hurt anybody. The boy mumbled his sincere apology. Minato couldn't stop watching the boy, and finally, a kind smile tugged his lips upward. They're okay. Nothing that a long nap can't help. The boy slowly and unsteadily nodded. He opened his mouth several times, but no words came out for several tries. Finally, he shook his head and glanced at Minato in the mirror. What will happen to me? Minato didn't answer immediately. Instead he chewed the inside of his mouth to gain some time while he was choosing his words carefully. You will have a room set up in here, and you will be under surveillance until we find another solution. If you show no sign of suspicion, you can either stay in Konoha, or you can leave freely. It will be your decision. The boy nodded and once again looked at his hands on the table. Minato stared at him in wonder before he hesitantly asked, Do you know what it means to be a shinobi associated with a village? The boy gradually nodded, not letting his eyes wander from his clenched hands. Minato curiously observed the boy until he couldn't stand the silence anymore. You knew that we were on the other side of the mirror, didn't you? The boy gave a foxy smirk to Minato, immediately warming up the previously serious mood. Well, that was pretty obvious. Minato shook his head. I mean, you knew where we were. You knew exactly how to pinpoint us, and also that Inoichi-san was approaching the room. How? The boy shrugged before he answered, I don't know. I just knew. He looked up to the mirror again and gave a smaller, but still cheeky, smile to Minato. You know, we got an eavesdropper, even now. The mirror vibrated suddenly as if someone on the other side had slammed their head into it in surprise. Minato couldn't conceal the chuckle that bubbled out from his lips and beckoned to the mirror. A minute later, Inoichi entered the room, sporting a brand new welt on his forehead. We made the arrangements. He can sleep on the first floor. The Anbu will escort him. Minato nodded and turned to the boy. I think that's enough for now. I'll let you get some rest. The boy nodded and made a hesitant glance at his wrist, where the two ink black markings stood out from his sun-kissed skin. He hesitantly raised his arms toward the blonde. I'm sorry, but do you think you can remove these other seals? I'm missing my chakra circulation, ya know. Minato immediately shook his head, but he still raised an eyebrow and carefully stored the previous information. Sorry, they will temporarily stay. Just a precaution. The boy nodded, but he couldn't mask the disappointed sour grimace. But he shook it off in the next blink and began to rise from his chair when his stomach gave a loud lurch. Minato chuckled and gave the boy a small smile. But I think I can help with that. The boy chuckled back and scratched the back of his head nervously. Yeah, I'm starving. I could eat anything right now, doesn't matter what it is. Even if it was worm soup. He paused and immediately shook his head to get rid of the disgusting idea and the grimace on his face. Worm soup, where the hell did that come from? His appalled face soon turned into a smile again, his eyes locked on Minato. He chewed on his lower lip hesitantly before he blurted out. Will we meet in the future? That is more than likely, Minato replied with a small smile. But they didn't get more time to chat. Two Anbu guards appeared beside the boy, but he didn't even flinch. Based on previous experience, he probably already knew they were nearby. He gave a last smile to Minato before they disappeared from the room within a fast shunshin. Inoichi stepped beside Minato and looked to the place where they had vanished. You know Minato, as strange as it sounds, I think I like this boy. Yeah, me too, Minato agreed with a hushed, puzzled voice. Minato stepped into the Hokage's office 10 minutes after he arranged a meal for the boy, and even if it was only cup ramen, it was still much better than worm soup. Sarutobi nodded to him in greeting and waved his hand invitingly towards the chair. The Hokage patiently waited for his shinobi to settle down, but his curiosity secretly ate away his mind. Am I right that you are finished with our little guest? Yes, Hokage-sama. He truly has amnesia. His general knowledge is unaffected. He knows about the countries, particularly the shinobi aspect, but his personal memories were all but eradicated, save one. Minato smirked. It seems that our little guest has a very honorable goal. What do you mean by that, Minato? The Hokage furrowed his brow. In his memory, he stated to a girl that he will break the cycle of hatred and bring peace to the world. That's quite an ambitious goal for a teenager, isn't it? Sarutobi stated. I left him at the torture and interrogation headquarters. They put him into one of the surveillance rooms. I also removed the paralysis seals, but I left the chakra binding seal on him as a precaution. He is also under 24-hour observation by an Anbu. I doubt that he can do anything with that seal. It's my own creation, not a standard one like before. Sarutobi nodded in agreement, letting Minato continue his report. The boy has a decent bank of general knowledge. However, it's strewn about quite chaotically. He also demonstrated a remarkable detection ability. He knew we were in the monitoring room. Everybody knows that there's always someone behind the mirror, muttered Sarutobi and leaned back in his seat. No, I mean he knew exactly where we were within the room. He looked into my eyes, and when I moved, he followed my movement. Sarutobi raised an eyebrow and shook his head. So we have a shinobi with a cage-level chakra system, remarkable sensing skills, and amnesia. Who knows the recipe for itching powder and the location of the nearest all-female bathhouse, chuckled Minato. A grunt left Hiruzen's mouth. The last thing this village needs is a fusion of Jiraiya and Kushina running around. Sarutobi shook his head. It's very unfortunate that, because of his memory loss, he remains a threat to the village. I don't think we can allow this risk to go unchecked. The War Council will urge the execution of the boy. I know, but if he were to defect to Konoha, we gain a strong ally. If we execute him now, that would make us merciless killers. His only crime as of now is that he knocked out 7 people due to a misunderstanding. Sarutobi hemmed, chewing his pipe in thought. I'll try to keep the boy's case under wraps, but I don't know how long we'll be able to play this game. If the boy becomes a shinobi of Konoha, the War Council will have no influence in his case. He would be under your command. If, is the key word here, Sarutobi stated doubtfully. If he would decide to join our side, he would be your responsibility. If he would do anything suspicious, you would report it immediately. I trust in your intuition and in you. And yes, he would be a very powerful ally indeed. A deep frown appeared on Minato's face. He couldn't forget the only visible symbol they've found. Hokage-sama, have you ever seen a forehead protector with the sign, Shinobi? The named aging man gave a curious look to the blonde and shook his head. No, I haven't, but it would be nice if our kind wouldn't be shattered by villages, by different beliefs. If we became united under that symbol. But I guess it's currently a utopia. Minato nodded, and a thick silence fell between the men briefly. Minato, I want you to take a break. You haven't been yourself since you returned from your last mission in Kusa. I'm okay, I can handle it. Sarutobi shook his head and looked at him purposefully. No, you can't. Nobody can go this long without a break. Not even you. I told you, I'm fine. My comrades need me on the battlefield. Minato protested, but immediately regretted it. He shook his head and realized that he had stood up during his outburst. When he sat down again, the Hokage gave him a sad smile. I don't want to risk the loss or mental condition of one of my best shinobi, of my good friend. Minato rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand and let out a long resigned sigh. How long am I off duty? Until I deem as necessary, but I advise you at least 3 weeks. After that, we can talk about your service again. The third observed him for a second before he opened his mouth again. You seem to be much better after your talk with the brat. Other than your recent outburst, that is. Minato smiled back at him. Yes, he is very interesting. Be careful not to get too close. He could be dangerous, the Hokage answered with a deep, concerned frown. Minato slowly rose from his seat and walked toward the open window. He gave one last glance over his shoulder to Hiruzen, a wide smirk plastered on his face. His last words echoed inside the empty office for long minutes after he was gone with the flash of his golden locks. So can I. Minato was lying in his bed with his arms crossed behind his head as he stared at the ceiling unblinkingly. He had been trying to sleep for the past hour, but his wandering thoughts restrained him from drifting into a well-deserved dream. He turned his head to the side to face the slim woman next to him. Her chest moved up and down in the rhythm of her breathing. Her long, ruby-red hair flowed around her peaceful form and gave a perfect frame to her face's delicate features. He reached out and gently stroked a tuft of hair away from her face that disturbed her perfection. The young woman mumbled something incoherent and moved a little in her sleep, allowing another tuft of hair to replace the previous one. A gentle smile tugged Minato's lips upward and didn't bother himself to brush it away, instead turning toward the ceiling again. His thoughts wandered to the blonde boy. Clashing feelings met in his mind as he thought over the events. First of all, none of the security seals sensed his appearance. The seals could be circumvented if someone were to reduce his chakra levels to near depletion, but that was just unimaginable. Nobody could suppress his chakra to that extreme, it was impossible. Every living thing radiated a minimal amount, regardless of how hard someone tried and how skilled and well-trained they were. Only dead bodies were completely free of chakra, and the boy was clearly anything but. Underground or aerial entry were also unrealistic possibilities. The seals surrounding the village were like an invisible barrier and every intruder would be sensed. It could be a space-time ninjutsu, but again, that was also very unrealistic. With that kind of life-threatening injury, it was impossible for anyone to perform a top-ranked jutsu like that. And the seals would also trigger his arrival. However, if someone else had performed the jutsu on him, that seemed the most believable scenario. But that would still trigger the security system. Minato made a half nod. When he passed the danger of death, he showed remarkable healing abilities. This was not something new, though it was very rare since the destruction of Whirlpool Country and the Uzumaki clan. His eyes instinctively wandered toward the woman next to him, then back to the ceiling, his eyes narrowing slightly as his mind moved to the next question that hadn't let him fall asleep. The Anbu checked his belongings, but they found nothing significant other than a scroll and seal tags in his pouch. He didn't have a Hittite, or perhaps he lost it before his arrival. That seemed likely, seeing his clothes were also tattered beyond recognition. They couldn't find any clan symbols on what was left of the fabric. Minato already checked the scroll and the seal tags. The tags were safe, simple exploding tags modified with increased or decreased potency. This was why they hadn't recognized them immediately. It was fairly uncommon practice. For him, a simple once-over of them was enough. The only really interesting thing in his belongings was the soul scroll, and it annoyed him to no end. He couldn't open it. He was one of the rare seal masters, but he couldn't handle a teenager's seal. The closing seal was a combination. The opener had to have a special type of chakra, combined with blood identification, and 3 other specific methods of which he was still unclear. The eluding symbols were just a big mess of gibberish. When the boy had first woken up, confused and disorientated, speaking about a genjutsu, it gave a small comfort to everyone's mind. It's not without precedent that a shinobi under the pressure of war broke and suffered mental damage. There was also a man who had been captured in a high-level genjutsu for weeks during the first year of the war, and he couldn't accept reality for days. He was paranoid and saw enemies at every turn. However, the boy was conscious, and he was aware of his surroundings, and it didn't match with the previous case. One thing was certain. He repeatedly mentioned a red-eyed person, and genjutsu plus red eyes pointed only to one option, an Uchiha. Konoha's police force was already informed about the case and ordered to investigate, but they reported that no one from the clan had ever had a confrontation with him. No one admitted to it, anyway, but there wasn't any reason for them to keep it secret. If his opponent wasn't from the clan, that meant there was someone outside the village wandering around with a Sharingan. The frown deepened on Minato's face. The boy recognized him in Sarutobi, but that wasn't a big deal. After all, Sarutobi was the Hokage, and he himself was marked in every single bingo book. What was bothering him was the emotions the boy had showed. What he saw and what Sarutobi mentioned. It just didn't make any sense. Sadness, sorrow in those eyes, full of shame in the end. He didn't even have the courage to look into Minato's eyes. When he was faced with an enemy, Minato knew what he'd find in their eyes when they recognized Konoha's yellow flash. Fear, panic, but not shame. If he was captured in enemy territory, he was sure he wouldn't feel what Sarutobi found in the boy's eyes. Respect. Okay, maybe. One should always respect their enemy, especially a powerful one, but he was certain that hope and relief would be the furthest from his mind if he found himself face to face with any of the cages. And he'd absolutely never call any of them Gigi. He shook his head to banish the unpleasant thought about his bloody death if he ever called the Tsuchikage that way and tried to calm his mind. His panic attack in the end was reasonable, but its cause wasn't. The root cause wasn't because he was faced with strong opponents, it was because he realized that he really wasn't under a genjutsu. The real question was, what had happened to the boy that he couldn't accept the fact that this was reality? He let out a soft sigh and turned toward the ruby-haired woman next to him. Minato already accepted the boy's sensing skills. It wasn't to be considered a threat, but a great advantage on the battlefield. Inoichi gathered some very interesting information during the time he was in his mind. The basic knowledge that he had also matched up with a seasoned shinobi's. But come on, itching powder. A small smile appeared on his face automatically, but it was gone with his next thought. Minato's mind drifted to the memory fragment that Inoichi had shown them, to the words the boy used during that memory. His voice echoed inside his mind. I'll break the cycle of hatred. I'll break the curse. If there is such a thing as peace, I'll find it. Believe in me. This is the legacy that they left for me. Those sentences convinced him that the boy didn't mean harm to the village. No spy would choose a goal as noble as that. Minato turned over and crossed his arms beneath his head to watch the ceiling. Evidence pointed to a fight. His injuries, his torn clothes, the chakra exhaustion. Someone tried to get rid of the blonde, and he was almost successful. Someone used a space-time ninjutsu on him that transferred the boy to Konoha, perhaps to get rid of the body, and that someone was an Uchiha. He turned to his partner to hug her to him and finally get some sleep. His eyelids soon became heavy, and he let them fall by the call of gravity and exhaustion. He bedded himself closer to his peacefully sleeping companion to enjoy the warmth of the woman, who moved a little when she felt the soft touch of his body. Minato smiled with closed eyes, but stayed still so as not to disturb her dream. A loud snore bubbled out from Kushina and Minato's eyes flung. It didn't stop. She continued her disturbing symphony until Minato's head started to side, cursed to himself silently, and closed his eyes again, attempting to block out the irritating noise from his mind. Minato was staring at the teenage boy in front of him as he almost inhaled his 5th cup of instant ramen for breakfast, while he himself held his 2nd cup of coffee. He had another long night and woke up before the alarm to hand in his full report to the Hokage about the last 3 days of their guest. The Namikaze watched the boy with amusement, and he couldn't help the words that slipped out from his mouth. You know, that stuff isn't too healthy. Especially not for breakfast. The young blonde drank the last bit of the soup and patted his stomach with satisfaction before leaning back in the chair, which gave a plaintive squeak under his weight in response. I know, but that was the first thing that came to mind when they asked about breakfast, and it's delicious. You really like that trash, don't you? The boy didn't answer, instead shrugging with a wide, toothy grin plastered on his face. Minato considered continuing the topic but instead chose to be straightforward. Any news about your memory? The young boy shook his head and fixed his eyes onto the floor, counting the tiles under him to avoid contact. Nope, nothing. I thought that maybe I'd dream about my life, but I just blacked out again, he muttered to one of the tiles. The slight frown deepened on Minato's face, and he sipped his coffee to make his brain work properly. You know, the boy had started but then stopped. What? Minato looked at him questioningly. You know, maybe I don't want to remember. His voice dropped to a low volume, almost whispering, while he still stared at the floor beneath him, stubbornly refusing to meet the Junin's searching blue eyes. The first night, I mourned for the blonde girl. I don't even know who she was and still. It still hurts. The blonde looked up at him, the once vibrant blue ocean darkened to a royal blue, while a small, sad smile tugged his lips upward. I want a new life. If possible, a happy one. I don't want to start it with mourning over people I don't even know. The blonde's voice was now filled with determination, but when he finished, he had looked down again to escape from Minato's eyes while shame flushed through his own. It doesn't hurt if I don't remember anything, he whispered in a soft tone more to convince himself than the other blonde. Minato had been observing the blonde boy for several minutes with a wary face, but he said nothing, just moved to a more comfortable position in his chair before he tried to break the blonde's dark thoughts. If you want to start over, first we should find a fitting name for you. It would be nice if I had a proper one. I really hate it when everyone calls me Blondie. It's annoying, the boy whined while crossing his arms in front of his chest like an irritated child. It was so out of scene in the depths of Konoha's torture and interrogation force. But Minato couldn't help but let a wide, cheeky smile spread across his face. What about Cane, Gold? That isn't much better than Blondie, the boy muttered and rolled his eyes in displeasure. You don't like it? Then how about Goldie? Minato chuckled. Very funny. Anything particular in your mind? The boy had thought for a second then shook his head. Nothing. Odoroki Toroku. That would suit you, wondered Minato. Because that was what the boy was to him. A wonder. A surprise that fell from the sky. And every single time he looked into his azure eyes, he got a strange feeling. Like looking into a mirror that reflected his own soul. Barren. And sometimes he hated what he saw there. Azure Surprise. What a kind of name is that? However, Toroku. The blonde tried out how it sounded, rolling the words on his tongue several times, tapping his chin with his index finger. I like that one. He smirked. Then it's settled. Toroku, grinned Minato. The newly named Toroku had given a foxy grin in exchange and maneuvered himself to a more comfortable position. Can I go outside? In the future. But not today, I'm afraid. Toroku had given a disappointed look but nodded. He had already made the first step toward his new life. And for now, that was enough. And he was satisfied, really. However, he wouldn't be able to shake off the sour taste from the side of his tongue for the rest of the day. Toroku knew Konoha was far away from trusting him, but he really hoped that he could explore the village that day. He wasn't handling the isolation very well, even though it was only his third day. He was bored to death and thirsty for the outside world. His room was small and plain with a bed in the corner, a desk with 2 chairs, and a small bathroom connected to it. The room obviously wasn't meant for comfort and entertainment. It was still much better than the hospital room and the horrid smell of illness, blood, and disinfectant. He leaned back on the bed and contemplated his situation after Minato left his room. The first night was a hard one. After the Anbu escorted him to this room, he was completely drained. Toroku just collapsed to the bed in his clothes, but after struggling for hours to sleep, he gave up. Though he didn't want to think, that was his only option to kill time. He turned on his back and crossed his arms beneath his head, watching the pale ceiling while another familiar blonde was doing the same on the other side of the village. He thought about the only memory of his old life he was able to regain, and it unnerved him. He felt sorrow and regret for the blonde girl, and he sunk into the deep abyss, mourning for the young Kunoichi. He was sure that she was a ninja, and he was also certain that he himself was also one. During the questioning, when Makoto had asked about random things, he knew perfectly what the man was talking about, but without any connecting memory. He knew about ninjutsu, what a chakra release was, how to do it, and so on. But before he had heard the terms, he didn't know about their existence. The information just sort of popped up. He had this knowledge buried deep in the pit of his mind, lying dormant until he had to access it. Makoto also mentioned various names. Kurama, a picture of an animal jumped into his mind, but he couldn't identify what it was. Maybe a dog, perhaps. Uchiha, this name left a bittersweet feeling in his chest. The mixture of hatred and caring. But nothing else. No recollection of a memory, just vague emotions. When he thought about the pink-haired Kunoichi, his heart swelled with adoration, but in the background of his mind, an uneasy feeling was already starting to prod. Sakura, it is, or was, her name. As the picture of the dead blonde girl flowed again into his mind, he shook his head. He didn't want another painful memory. He didn't want to feel that sorrow ever again. He received a second chance to become a better, and perhaps happier, person. His own voice echoed in his mind. I'll break the cycle of hatred. I'll break this curse. If there is such a thing as peace, I'll find it. Believe in me. This is the legacy that they left for me. Those were strong words. Those were the words of someone who lived through a hard life. He didn't know if he was ready for this burden. He didn't know if he wanted anything to do with it. However, the thought of turning away from it made his heart constrict. Legacy. His thoughts flashed through the memory again and stopped at another part. I don't go back on my word. That is my nindo. That statement made his heart ache with determination and pride. It felt pleasant. This was something he should follow. But change the world and bring peace. How can he do that? He closed his eyes and moved to face the wall behind his bed. He had been struggling between a new future without memories in a brand new life and a future which seemed to only bring him pain if he regained his memories. His thoughts moved to what Minato told to him. He could stay and join Konoha, or he could leave freely. But what would he do if he left? Where would he go? Toroku let out a sigh and tried to occupy himself with something other than thinking to avoid his mind float again to those depressing thoughts. He moved his eyes toward the ceiling until he found his only other entertainment in the small, empty room. A tiny spider in the corner started to settle down in Konoha. The base of a spider web was already formed, steadily attached to the surface of the white walls. The blonde fixed his vibrant, azure eyes on the small black dot as it was making a perfect spiral from the thin, almost invisible material defining its new home. I'm bored to death. Minato arched an amused eyebrow at the frustrated blonde boy. Was he whining? I want to do something. Anything. Yes, he was whining. Despite the Konoha Junin's more frequent visits, Toroku couldn't occupy himself. He and one of the Anbu guards brought him books, but he missed the outside world and the normal connection with people. A frustrated groan bubbled out from Toroku's mouth once more while he folded his arms in front of his chest with a well-defined pout. That was too much for Minato. He burst out with a barking laughter and stepped closer to the sulking, and now also annoyed, teen when he could finally gather his composure. You've only been here for a week, and you slept through the most of it. Endure it for a little longer. Minato chuckled once more and reached into his vest pocket to take out a small book and handed it to Toroku. I brought you something that might help you out. A grimace spread across the boy's face instantly, turning the small print several times. Another book. Look, I don't want to seem ungrateful, but reading just isn't my style. It contains brain teasers. I want you to solve them by this afternoon. I'll come back at 3 to pick it up, so you have roughly 6 hours to finish them. The boy raised his right eyebrow at Minato while suspiciously eyeing the book like it could bite off his hand at any time. Why, it'll keep you occupied. Minato smiled at Toroku, who frowned and finally flipped it open. Keep me occupied, my. Toroku groaned. When Minato left him alone with the book, he moved onto the bed and was now sitting on it, his legs crossed, staring at the book in his lap. After he had read the first 2 pages, he knew exactly what it was all about. The book contained tests about several competencies and aspects. This is a damn IQ test. He shouted out into the empty room waiting for an answer that never came, desperately seeking interaction with anyone or anything. He glanced up to the corner with the small black spider, in the hope that it'll react. But of course it didn't reply, nor did it acknowledge him in any ways. I really hate books, he grumbled, shook his head and turned his attention back to the book in his lap. He had read again the last exercise on the page and let out a sigh. He quickly wrote down his answer and flipped the page. Minato received the book from one of the Anbu that was in charge of Toroku. At 1 o'clock, he managed to finish it more than 2 hours before the deadline. He eagerly flipped through the pages to check the answers but only to realize that there was a reason that he had received the book much earlier. Namely that it was only half done. Several pages were left unfinished or even untouched. Like Toroku got tired of them halfway. And most likely that was the case since almost the same kind of exercises were neatly done some pages before, so he would have been able to do the missed ones. His brows furrowed when his eyes had trailed to the left corner and caught several sketches on the margin. His frown deepened as he flipped more and more pages. It changed from page to page. It was nothing more than a round scribble on the first pages, but it soon evolved into a black, spiral-like thing. The yellow flash narrowed his eyes and focused on the sketches as he flipped the pages with his fingers. A moving form animated from the sketches. A whirling spiral with a hole in its left side. Was it a whirlwind, or the eye of an unstoppable storm? It could mean a lot, or it was also possible that it meant nothing in particular. A deep frown carved up onto Minato's forehead, and he opened it again to, this time, summarize the answers. So how many? Toroku asked with a sullen tone in his voice during a morning visit of Minato. It was almost a week since he gave back that damn book to him, and the Junin hadn't said a word about it. How many what? He asked indifferently. You know, my IQ. Minato blinked in surprise at his statement and stared back at the boy. It's average. Toroku shot back a skeptical glance but said nothing. I spoke with the Hokage yesterday. The boy shrugged and continued to observe the tiny spider in the corner. I asked for more freedom for you. Now that caught the boy's interest. Toroku's eyes had widened in his surprise and hopefulness flooded his face, desperately waiting for Minato to finally finish the sentence. He gave permission. You can leave the institution but only under surveillance. Toroku's mouth morphed into the widest grin Minato had ever seen on his face. Minato mirrored him, but maybe a bit more moderately. Are you just going to sit there, or should we take this outside? Toroku instantly hurtled from his bed and stretched his arms behind his head, still grinning like an idiot. Readier than ever, Datbeo. Minato arched an eyebrow, but let it go. Then come on, we're heading out. Chiroku enjoyed the feeling of a warm breeze and sunshine on his face, his eyes closed. He let out a strange sound, something between a satisfied sigh and a moan, and turned to Minato. Hey, can we pick up something to eat? You just finished your breakfast. And I doubt that you have any money in your pockets. Chiroku had raised his left hand behind his head and nervously scratched the back of his neck. Oh, yeah, I totally forgot about that. It's okay if we just walk. Minato had given him a smile and waved his hand as a sign to follow him. They strolled on the wide streets without a real destination, letting their legs choose the path. The blondes passed by an uncountable number of shops filled with goods and traveling vendors, shouting how fresh and high quality the products they were selling were. Finally, they reached a great square filled with people going after their daily tasks. Chiroku had stopped to watch them all as they marched up and down, everyone with their own concern. A man in standard shinobi clothes had jumped down to the ground from a window only to gracefully land nearby. He had noticed Minato, and with a small, greeting nod he shunshined out of the crowd with a flicker of his chakra. A minute later, a woman in casual clothes stepped to the wall of a building to defy gravity by walking parallel to the ground a few feet above them, evading the thick crowd. Chiroku smiled and continued watching the citizens of Konoha living their everyday life. He wordlessly listened to the village's pulse, beating together with the rhythm of the soft breeze. It buzzed continuously over his head, but it wasn't disturbing. It was like the peaceful moment when after a long and cold winter, the first real sunbeams lure you out from the house. And you were answering the call, settling down under a tree and listening to the first bees' buzzing noise as they were flying over your head as spring's first messengers, looking for sweet nectar above your head. He had looked up at the monument of the previous Hokage and tilted his head to the side. He had been staring at them for several minutes before he shook his head in discomfort. Minato had stepped beside him and traced back his eyes curiously. These are the mementos of our past leaders. I know. Minato looked at the blonde with a raised eyebrow but didn't comment on it, waiting for him to continue. I just have a feeling that something is missing from it. Chiroku shook his head and gave a last suspicious look at the monument. It would look great with some more colors on it. He had given a smirk to Minato, who responded with a disapproving frown. A group of children passed beside them, running, laughing and arguing about their biggest concern, what to play and where to go next. In the next second, Chiroku suddenly swayed, almost losing his balance. And the cause? Simple. One of them had been arguing so enthusiastically that he disregarded everything around him, bumping into Chiroku from behind and almost pushing him to the ground. Hey, why don't you watch where you're going? You're in the way, moron. The child shouted indignantly, pointing an accusing finger at him. Minato watched the scene from the corner of his eye, but he didn't interrupt. He was curious as to how he would handle the situation. Chiroku narrowed his eyes and leaned closer to the boy. You should watch your step and your mouth. You were the one who bumped into me. Apologize. Quote, a soundless glaring contest started between the two boys before it was interrupted by a girl from the running group. What's that on your face? Chiroku blinked in his surprise and touched his left cheek while he turned toward the girl, only to realize that the boy's whole group was now staring at them alongside the other villagers. He gently stroked a finger along the soft line of one of his whisker marks while he straightened from his stooped pose to face the girl. It looks creepy, declared the naughty boy in front of him. You know, your face isn't any better with those marks under your eyes, Chiroku stated as he snapped his head back toward the arrogant child. This is our clan's symbol, you dumb. Chiroku's eyes narrowed again and tilted his head. Only one stoic word left his mouth. But it almost caused a small war. Shrimp. The boy had narrowed his eyes in response, his muscles tensing as he breathed in a large amount of air in order to launch a barrage of obscenities at the blonde. Before the arguing could reach a fever pitch, Minato stepped between them. I think it's time for us to go. No, Chiroku stated in a deliberate, commanding voice, stopping his escort in the middle of turning to follow his own advice. Minato blinked and narrowed his eyes to the blonde. That was not the response he was expecting. He was rude and unmannerly. I'm staying until he apologizes. Minato let out a sigh, but before he could say anything, Chiroku again turned his attention to the boy in front of him. Take responsibly for your actions. You bumped into me, and instead of apologizing you insulted me. Learn some manners. If you're from a clan, then you'll become a ninja, and shinobi can't be irresponsible. If you make a decision, there will always be consequences. An irresponsible ninja is reckless and will end up dying early. He crossed his arms in front of his chest and steadfastly stared into the eyes of the child for a seemingly never-ending minute. Minato was impressed. I applause. Chiroku raised an eyebrow at the baffling mumble of the boy. I said I apologize for my behavior. You happy? The boy had also crossed his arms in front of his chest and turned aside. Minato's left eyebrow rose until it reached his Hittite on his forehead. Indeed, very impressed. A wide, satisfied grin spread across Toroku's face, and he ruffled the boy's hair, who only responded with annoyed mumbling. Apology accepted. Take care, shrimp. With a grin, he turned to Minato to follow their previous route into the city center. He could hear the boy's displeased voice at his nickname. They were walking side by side for several minutes before Minato looked at him. You're good with children. Toroku shrugged. Dunno. I just felt that that was the right thing to do. Minato smiled and nodded. Well, I think you deserve a reward after that little scene. 5 minutes later, they reached a small stand. Wide white stripes hung down from the roof to shroud the inside and to display an advertisement of the place with bright red letters. Ichiraku's ramen bar was empty as they approached the 4 bars stools. They sat down and Toroku gave a sad smile to Minato. I don't have any money. This is a reward. That means it's my treat. That immediately conjured a grin on Toroku's face, and he started to examine the menu card in front of him. Ichiraku had turned toward them and gave a wide smile to his customers. The usual, Minato-kun. Minato just nodded as a welcome and also in his approval. And for the young man, Taichu finally turned toward the other golden crown to face with his customer. Well, at least he wanted, but Toroku hid his whole face behind the menu, only his golden crown visible while he was lost in his small word as he dug through every single offered dish. Even his tongue was out, and his brow furrowed in concentration. He took his sweet time for sure. After long minutes, he finally slammed the menu down on the counter only to order the first one from the card. A miso ramen, and after Minato's disapproving glare he added a faint, please. Taichu nodded and turned to prepare the 2 meals, giving some privacy to his newest customer. Toroku swept his eyes over the small place, and a familiar warm feeling swelled in his chest. Comfort, an unbeatable power tugged his lips upward into a sincere smile. He did nothing, told nothing, only let the feeling overwhelm his inside until he heard the distinct rattle of a bowl being placed in front of him. Only then did he turn back to the counter to reach for 2 sets of chopsticks and handed one to Minato. Itadakimasu, the 2 blondes stated in unison, and they shared a knowing look with each other. You know, Minato-kun, you 2 look very alike. Is he your relative? Minato shook his head and smiled an awkward smile. No, he's a guest of Konoha. A guest. Ichiraku raised a doubting eyebrow but didn't comment on the strange statement or, more likely, on the tone of it. For minutes, only satisfied slurping could be heard inside the small stand. But it soon stopped as one blonde fixed his gaze on his half-eaten dish while the other was observing his still form like a hawk. Minato was the hawk, and Toroku, he had been fixing his eyes on the floating pink and white fishcake in his bowl. His mind blanked out, the scene overwhelming his eyesight. He slowly started to hover around it with the chopsticks, and now he was staring at the whirling fishcake with blank eyes. Something important. He knew deep in his mind that this was connected to something important. He frowned, but his mind stayed completely blank, waiting for something to happen, waiting for a memory to trigger, or an emotion to wash over him like before. But nothing came. He used his chopstick to make the fishcake whirl again, trusting that maybe this time something would happen. He focused his sight at the slowly whirling symbol. It felt very familiar. So damn familiar, but he couldn't find a grasp it. Minato had noticed the blonde's weird behavior and his blank expression. He had turned toward him and tilted his head to the right to observe, but he found only focused concentration. It felt like he could touch it with his bare hands. Naruto. The blonde flung his head up and stared at the familiar blue eyes, wrinkles deepening on his forehead even more, if that was possible. It's Naruto. You don't like it. Toroku shook his head and stared down into his bowl at the slowly spinning fishcake, stopping its movement with his chopstick. It's not that. I don't know. I don't know really. He put down his chopsticks and turned around to face the ceiling in his discomfort. A deep frown spread across Minato's forehead. You remembered something. Toroku shook his head again. This time in denial. No, it was just a feeling. It felt like something important and familiar. But nothing happened. Awkward silence settled down between the 2 men. Neither of them touched their dish. I've been thinking a lot about what you said to me. Toroku's voice finally broke the stillness, gaining Minato's attention in an instant. About my possibilities. That I can leave. A deep, troubled frown dug into Minato's fine skin for the 100th time during the week with Toroku, but it was soon replaced by a new emotion. Disappointment rose in his chest. He hardened his expression and continued listening. But I don't have anywhere else to go. I don't even know where else I could go. He had looked to Minato and hardened his own expression. I want to stay in Konoha. His eyes were brimming with determination while Minato let out the breath he wasn't realizing he was holding in. I want to stay here, and I also want to offer my services to the village as a shinobi. Quote. Minato blinked away his surprise and answered with a soft smile. I understand. I'll inform the Hokage about this. But be aware that the final decision will be in his hands. Toroku nodded and smiled back, relieved. He wanted to start the day with this, but he couldn't find the proper opportunity to bring it up. The heavy burden about his new future left his shoulders. He struggled with his options throughout the night, but he finally made his decision. A low, girlish chuckle broke the silence, followed by more low and soft womanly voices weaving their way through the white stripes. He's really here. Look. The girls continued to gossip in front of the stand. Should we go in? Minato palmed his forehead while muttering to himself. Today of all days. Hey, Minato-kun, it seems it's time to sound the retreat, isn't it? Ichiraku grinned at him. You need a hand. Minato immediately nodded and put the money on the counter while beckoning to the confused blonde to follow him to slip out the back door, just in time for Toroku to see 3 young girls peeping inside the stand between the white stripes. They had made it to the next street and Toroku gave a suspicious look to Minato. Are you some kind of celebrity or something? Asked the young blonde, with arms crossed and eyebrows raised. Don't you dare ask anything. Minato had given an ice-cold glare to Toroku, who in turn dismissed the burning question from his mind but not without shooting a knowing look with a foxy grin to the older blonde. Minato shot one more warning glare and glanced upward at the sun. It's time for us to head back, he stated to the teenager. Yeah, our 2 friends must be pretty bored by now. Toroku nodded his head toward the rooftop where the 2 Anbu flinched at the statement under the shadows. Minato just shook his head slowly and turned around to escort Toroku back to his room. Minato was now heading toward the top story of the Hokage Tower. The last rays of the descending sun were painting a cavalcade of warm colors on the building's white walls. The first stars were already starting to appear lazily on the darkening canvas of the night sky. Instead of the main entrance, he chose a more scenic route in order to avoid a certain secretary. He walked toward an open window parallel to the ground. He had peeped inside and grinned as he heard the Sandame's soft snores. His head rested on his folded arms as he leaned on a big tower of most likely important documents, using them as a pillow. He chuckled to himself and walked toward his respected leader to wake him up, but he found something very tempting on the desk that broke his concentration. He thought for a moment before letting the grin grow wider on his delicate features. He moved nearer to his leader and shook his hand in front of his face to be sure he was still sleeping. His white hair was swayed tenderly by the discreet movement of his hand. No reaction. He stepped aside and placed his hand on the top of a white triangle-shaped hat and sneaked one last short peek over his shoulder at the sleeping Sandame. He grabbed the hat and slowly put it onto his head and slinked quietly toward the small mirror to admire his work. Before he could reach his destination a noise had echoed through the silent office as the Hokage cleared his throat to draw his attention. Minato had jumped backward and landed less gracefully than he had intended in the middle of the room, a kunai in his hand ready to attack. The hat tilted down to the side of his face awkwardly. He stared toward the desk and saw Sarutobi leaning on it, his head propped up by his hand. He was observing Minato, tapping his chin with his index finger as if lost in thought, like a father thinking of a proper punishment for his child. Hokage-sama. Minato had smiled nervously toward the desk while he straightened himself. You know Minato, I think I don't want to comment this. Minato slowly got rid of the hat by putting it back on the desk as he stepped forward. Sarutobi just shook his head and smiled at him in forgiveness. So what brings you here? Not just the fashion thing, I think. Sorry, the temptation was too much to ignore. Minato gave a small apologetic smile toward his leader. Hiruzen eyed the man for a long moment before his lips turned into a mischievous smile. You will have enough time for that later. Minato paused for a fraction before tossing the comment to the side, but carefully storing it. I came to report that Todoroki Toroku made his decision. He wants to join Konoha's shinobi force. Sarutobi nodded as he prepared his pipe, eventually filling the room with gently floating tobacco smoke. So be it, I'll accept but only with several conditions. The Sandame was waiting for Minato's response, but when he received none, he continued after a drag from his pipe. I want him to stay under high observation for 2 weeks, and for the time being, he will stay at the torture and interrogation force where we can keep more of an eye on him. For the sake of safety, make an appointment with Inoichi once a week until further notice. And as I already said, you are responsible for him. He's not allowed on the streets of Konoha alone during this period. Also, before being assigned to any groups we need to measure his abilities and his ninja skills properly. Arrange one of the training grounds and a sparring partner for him in 1 or 2 days. Minato nodded, his composure loosening as an invisible weight was lifted from his shoulders. I'm grateful for your decision. This means we don't need to worry about the council anymore. Indeed, they were starting to become very active about the boy's case. Sarutobi had given him a warm smile as he finally really looked at Minato. You seem much better. Yeah, that's true. Kushina also stopped complaining about my mood swings, he admitted with a sour grimace. I'm aware of your more frequent visits with Toroku. The Anbu always keep me up to date about the boy's status. Actually, they are quite frustrated with him. He always seems to spot them, regardless of what they do, Sarutobi chuckled. I'm not surprised. He tramples on their pride continuously. Maybe he's giving them a little push to improve. It's actually really a shame that a teenager can simply play with our elites like that. About the visits, I have to occupy myself during my break, and Toroku is always a guaranteed good time. Minato smiled back, but it soon morphed into a wide grin. He's starting to become more comfortable. He's a healthy teenager in a lot of aspects. Sometimes he acts so much like Kushina. Minato gave a wandering look to Sarutobi and tilted his head toward the ceiling as he continued his line of thoughts. Yesterday, he loosened the salt shaker's head while we were eating. I had to throw my whole breakfast away. The blonde grunted in irritation and received a chuckle from the third. Minato shook his head and took out a scroll from his vest. Anyway, I think that's all for today. Here's my full report with all of the details of today's observation. If there isn't anything more, I'd like to head home. Sarutobi nodded and watched as the young shinobi disappeared from his office in the blink of an eye after he bowed to the third. He moved to the window to catch the last rays of the setting sun. Hiruzen lazily inhaled a puff from his pipe and exhaled it slowly, watching as the smoke drew abstract forms in the air before disappearing. He was unsettled. The thought that Toroku managed to befriend Minato in such a small amount of time troubled him. He still could be an undercover agent waiting to regain his memories and strike, possibly at Minato himself, and going by the new information, it was more than feasible that this was a very elaborate and very well-prepared assassination. Sarutobi had slowly turned to his desk to pull open a drawer and retrieve its contents. He flipped open the bulky file, fixing his eyes on the first page with Toroku's goofily smiling picture. He couldn't hide its contents for long, he had to tell Minato. He let out a disturbed sigh and after placing back the thick file to its previous place, he moved back to the window to admire the full moon in the now inky black